we have to always, especially when you use language from one field to another, we have to be careful of what we are transferring. And we've seen that in a number of other circumstances where you would use the language of war to address other phenomena. So when we talk about cyber warfare and IHL, I think we have to, in some way, very much limit what we are. So here, when I talk about IHL and cyber warfare, I talk means and methods of warfare that would use information technology, the transmission of data, as a means to adversely affect the operations of the other side. We're talking about a situation of armed conflict. Now, we also have to think that when we talk about IHL, what's the prime objective of IHL, and what are the consequences of the hostilities, of the use of means of warfare in the real world. What we're concerned about is about the consequences of using such means and methods of warfare. What are the consequences in the real world? What are the consequences on civilian population, and all those categories of persons which are protected under IHL? So there's already been given some examples of what can eventually be the consequences of use of cyber means and methods of warfare, including consequences that might affect either transportation system, information system, and eventually the release of dangerous substances, whether chemical or other industrial plants. Now, when we talk about IHL, we talk about the rules that are applicable in the situation of armed conflict. And it's to protect persons who are affected by an armed conflict, and also to limit the means that are used by the parties to the conflict. Now, when we talk about armed conflict, it's a very specific definition for IHL because it defines what is the scope of application of IHL. And we should also there be careful because those same terms don't mean the same thing in other contexts. So when we talk about armed conflict in IHL, we talk about resort to force between two states or between a state and a non-state actor, etc. Now the idea is the problem is that when you look at the definition of armed conflict, you say resort to armed force. Does a cyber attack or the use of a cyber means of warfare would amount to armed force? That will have two aspects. There's a use in bellow aspect. That is, does it amount to an armed attack, and does it amount to, and would it trigger all the consequences that comes with a qualification of an armed attack on the use in bellow, and on the use of force? Would it trigger the right to self-defense, for instance? Under IHL, that's not really the issue. Under IHL, the question of armed conflict, the use of armed force, is to define the scope application of the rules, when they apply and where they apply. So, if you have an already existing armed conflict and you use cyber means or methods of warfare, you would probably apply the same IHL rules as to apply in any armed conflict with any means and methods of warfare. The tricky question would be, if you have only use of cyber means and methods of warfare, does it amount to an armed conflict regulated by IHL? So that would be a kind of cyber war, pure cyber war that would only take place in cyberspace without physical consequences for civilians outside in the real world. Now, there's no specific references in either of the IHL treaties to cyber warfare as such, or cyber means and methods of warfare. But as long as they would have the same effect as the use of conventional means of warfare, then they would be governed by IHL rules. And that's not the only instances where IHL rules have been applied to new means and methods of warfare that have been developed after the adoption of the rule. I think the most striking example before the adoption of the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention in 1977, especially with regard to the conduct of a survey, the applicable treaty rules were the 8th Convention of 1907. Those rules were adopted before the First World War. At the time, in terms of air warfare, what we were using is balloons. That doesn't mean that IHL did not provide for rules and principles applicable during the Second World War and afterwards until 1977 to regulate the use of air warfare or the use of missile warfare. It's not because there were not specific rules in the treaty that those means of warfare and that's regulated by IHL. So I think in terms of development of IHL, new means and methods of warfare are developed, I wouldn't say every day, but at least regularly, and principles are there to be applied, even if you don't have any specific rules in terms of their application to those new means and methods of warfare. If you look at Article 36 of Protocol 1, in fact, it's very telling that IHL itself as a principle, I would say as a rule or principle, saying that it will apply to new means and methods of warfare. Article 36 of Protocol 1 provides that states that the obligation, when they are acquiring new means and methods of warfare, to make sure that those are in conformity with IHL rules, which is very telling, saying that the future applies also. IHL rules apply to future means and methods of warfare. The difficulty is when you look at IHL rules and principles is how to apply them to those cyber means and methods of warfare. So how would you apply the principle of distinction? How would you apply the rules that protect specific objects? And this morning we already talked about medical installations, for instance. What activities of civilians with regard to cyber means and methods of warfare would be regarded as being direct participation in service that would then make them subject to direct attack. How about the application of the principle of precautions when we talk about cyber means and methods of warfare? And what about other unlawful methods of warfare in their relationship with cyber means and warfare like perfidy, etc.? Now, attacks is defined under Protocol 1 as acts of violence against the adversary, whether in offense or in defense. And it's a very specific definition for Protocol 1 for IHL. So it denotes at some point acts of violence with physical force, but does not include, for instance, initial propaganda, embargoes, or other non-physical means of psychological, political, or economic warfare. But it includes acts which will have physical damage to either person or object that go beyond the computer program data or data that is attacked. Now, the principles that applies in IHL in terms of conduct of a survey, you have distinction, proportionality, precautions, and the last one, the risk of causing unnecessary suffering. For the application of these principles, the main difficulty will be because of the nature of those cyber attacks, is how do you put them in IHL boxes, or in fact in international boxes sometimes. First of all, anonymity of communication. You don't know who is behind the attack. It might be a private individual, it might be a state authority. If we're talking about armed conflict, we're talking about the use of force or the use of hostility between two states or a state and a non-state actor. We're talking about hostility between organizations. The second difficulty will be the link with the conflict. IHL regulates everything that relates to the asserting of the conflict itself. It does not regulate all the relationship in one state or all the relationship between the two states at war. And then also the link with the parties. You might have, for instance, computer network attack that will go through third states. So what are the duties of those third states that would be neutral in the conflict, but where their territory, or at least computed on the territory, could also be part of an attack on another state. Also, the interconnection between the computer systems also has the problem in terms of application of IHL rules. Just think of the full distinction. What is military and what is civilian in cyberspace? And position of third party important. So when we talk about distinction, we talk about that obligation to distinguish at all times between civilian objects and military objectives. Now, even outside the issue of cyber attacks, that principle can be very difficult to apply when we talk about, especially the distinction between civilian objects and military objectives, when we talk about dual-use objects. And I think in the context of cyber warfare, that problem would be compounded in the sense that there you can have really a mix of installations or networks that would be both at the same time civilians and military. Now, in the case of the principle of distinction, you have different types of acts which are prohibited, direct attacks on civilian objects and civilian persons, and different attacks, which include those which employ a method or a means of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective. And the application of that rule in the case of cyber means of warfare will be quite irrelevant, or to which those that we can put a method of means of combat, the effect of which cannot be limited as required by IHL. You think of some kind of virus, for instance, where you can actually limit the effect of the program and the damage it could cause afterwards in the real world. The second principle was proportionality. Under the proposal, it's satisfied under the indiscriminate attack as well. So disproportionate attack or accidental injury or damage is considered in relation to concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. That's a very difficult test to go through, and because you're comparing different things. That is the damage that will be caused to civilians or civilian objects on one side, and on the other side, the military value of the attack. Now, especially in cyber warfare, you could think of, for instance, you have an attack on that would disrupt an energy grid. You would obviously have a direct military advantage if energy is produced for military purposes, but you could have also like a number of secondary effects that could affect civilian infrastructures. And you would have to add that in your assessment of whether the attack would be excessive or not. And it can go quite far in terms of what would be the knock-on effect of the attack on civilian infrastructure. So that would render the test even more difficult to apply, whether an attack would be proportionate or not. Lastly, the principle of precautions. All precautions must be taken to avoid, when the event, minimize the incidental loss of civilian life and reduce civilian damage to civilian objects, and that will also, principle, be applicable when you use cyber means and methods of warfare. So would a cyber attack be the method that would avoid excessive damage? Would that be the method that would, in the event, minimize civilian objects compared to a traditional attack when you use kinetic force? Lastly, there's a number of objects which are specially protected. This morning was already mentioned medical installations. We also have working installations containing dangerous forces where attacks are prohibited, even though they might have a military purpose. Those covers dams and nuclear power plant, Those have protection of the environment and also protection of objects which are essential for the survival of the civilian population. So these are all objects which are where attacks are prohibited, strongly prohibited. There are circumstances where they can be attacked, for instance, if they are used for military purposes, except for dams and nuclear power stations. And these also would have the application of those rules in the context of using cyber means of methods of warfare would have also to be taken into account. So I think in terms of, in contrast to the first speaker who was talking about cybersecurity, where I would say the perspective there is how do you regulate cyberspace. In the context of the relationship between IHL and cyber warfare, it's a bit the other way around. Is how do IHL rules apply in that context. So cyber operations are subject to IHL rules if they are taking place in the context of an armed conflict, and so they should take into account existing law. Most of the provisions are the ones which relate to distinction. So the obligation to make a distinction between civilian object and military objective. And I would say those kind of operations will be probably more difficult in terms of assessment, especially when some kind of provision has to be made of what kind of damage will be caused by an act. So it must be properly assessed whether certain types of actions would be inherently indiscriminate, or if so such a thing would be automatically legal weapon, and that is. So thank you very much.
Dari tadi beliau Pak